You're listening to the Love Unplugged podcast, episode 72. What is the Enneagram? How do you find your true type? How does the information the Enneagram provides benefit your self-discovery journey? Today, we are learning the answers to all these questions and so much more, from subtypes to wings and centers, all things that confused me when trying to fully understand how the Enneagram worked. We also dive a little deeper into types 1 and 3 and their motivations and unhealthy sides. So without further ado, let's jump on in. Hey there, I'm your host, Jessica Fergon, and I am passionate about doing the inner work needed to reach your goals. Let me be your guide as we navigate all the fears and insecurities that surface when it's time to step outside of your comfort zone. Along with my knowledgeable guests and industry experts, I'm here to teach you how to reawaken your life purpose and passion and create the steps to turn your intentions into action. Ultimately, my goal is to empower you to rise above those blocks holding you back and start living a life that you are worthy and deserving of. So come on, it's time to slow down, find a comfy spot with your favorite organic tea, and get inspired. Thank you for tuning in to the Love Unplugged podcast. Hello, loves. Today I am joined by Stephanie Barron-Hall. She is a certified Enneagram coach with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and she is finishing her master's in organizational communication as we speak. She is also an entrepreneur and the founder of 9 Types Go, through which she teaches Enneagram to individuals and teams. And today she is going to share it all with us so that we can uncover exactly how we show up in our lives and use it to benefit us going forwards. So welcome, Stephanie. I'm so honored to have you as my guest, and I'm so excited to learn all about your story and your passion, your business. But before we start, for those that don't know you yet, I would love for you to share a little bit about who you are.
Awesome. Hi, thanks so much for having me. So like Jessica said, I'm Steph Barron-Hall. I am an Enneagram coach and speaker, and basically I just love talking about the Enneagram. So that's basically the high level stuff you need to know about me. And I really enjoy actually talking about the Enneagram with people on Instagram. So that's kind of where I've connected with a lot of people and have been growing my business.
Amazing. So what led you to the Enneagram?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I've always been fascinated by human personality. I studied psychology in college, and then because I was like, oh my gosh, I love Myers-Briggs, I love StrengthsFinder, all these different things. And then after college, I was in this organization that had really great professional development, and we used this personality, system called Total SDI in the workplace. And Total SDI is actually really great for corporate environments. So it's also motivation-based like the Enneagram, which is really different from a lot of the other personality profiling tools that people use. So I was really into Total SDI, and my husband was like, oh, you might like this thing called the Enneagram. And he had gone to Enneagram Institute and printed out his type and his, some stuff about him. And I was like, oh, that sounds accurate. So then I was like, no, I'm good though, And then of course, a few months later, my sister was like, oh my gosh, you should really look into the Enneagram. So then after the second time, I was like, all right, fine. So that's how I got into it. And I've just kind of been obsessed ever since.
And then you started a business based on it. So how did you come to the point where you're like, okay, I kind of have a very deep passion for this now, and I want to do something with my life with it?
Right. So something to know about me is that I always kind of have a side hustle. So I had been working full time, like I mentioned, and I had a side hustle, and that kind of came to a close, and I was ready to move on from that. And so I thought, I need something new. So in 2017, I was listening to the podcast Side Hustle School. Have you ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that podcast. So I was listening to it, and somebody mentioned using mugs, like selling mugs with individualized strengths from StrengthsFinder on it. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. And I was like, I could totally do that with the Enneagram. So I hired a designer. And at the time, I was actually working in e-commerce merchandising. My husband also has a background in product management and product merchandising. So we kind of were well suited to do that. But we created coffee mugs for each Enneagram type and sold them. 2017 was our first kind of season with them. So that's kind of where the Instagram came from. That's where, the name came from, 9 Types Go, all of that. So that's where it started. And then it was a really big hit for like holiday, but throughout the year, it wasn't necessarily huge. But then in 2018, I started actually being asked to teach and talk to different groups about the Enneagram. And I was really interested in that, but I started also getting questions like, do you have any certification? Do you have any training, etc.? And so I was like, oh, I actually don't. So I started researching some training programs. Of course, I had a big old spreadsheet on like the cost and of each and the benefits of each and all that kind of stuff. So I ended up getting a certification to coach using the Enneagram in 2018. And that's also when I started realizing that people were actually more interested when I talked about the Enneagram rather than when I was talking about these coffee mugs, right? So January 2019 is when I actually started posting about the Enneagram tool and like information about the Enneagram tool on Instagram. And I kind of transitioned from the mugs to more about education and coaching services.
Okay. Now, what is Enneagram exactly? Like, I kind of want to get a better sense of it, like with other personality tests that are around right now, things like human design, it's based off of certain things like astrology and Kabbalah and chakras and all that stuff. What exactly is Enneagram based on of?
Sure. So the Enneagram is a motivation-based personality. I say personality system, and I've already said it a couple times today, because that's kind of the easiest way for people to understand it. But really, it's a growth tool. So it's based on 9 archetypes of personalities that are based on 9 core motivations. So the interesting thing about the Enneagram is, like human design, you mentioned some of the origins of that. And then you've also got like Myers-Briggs and there's, more Jungian psychology with that. And the Enneagram is different in that it actually comes from some actual varied backgrounds, varied teachers. Basically, these teachers would look at it's actually really complex, but basically like looking at these 9 core different motivations, and they built these archetypes around them, overlaid it with the symbol. There's all this math that goes into the way that the symbol looks. It's kind of varied in the origins, but there were like 3 main people: Claudio Naranjo, Oscar Ichazo, and George Yurdichev. And those 3 individuals are kind of, in a sense, like the people who founded the modern Enneagram.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, what exactly? So I've seen online a whole bunch of different tests. So with Enneagram, you take a personality type test and you basically answer a whole set of questions based on whether you disagree, agree, and whatnot, and the level between them that you agree with that question, if it relates to you or not. Are there certain tests that you should be taking? Like, how do you know you're taking the right test that's actually going to give you a true result?
Yeah, I know. That's kind of one of the challenges. So my position on tests is that I don't think tests are very helpful a lot of the time. For some people, they can be really helpful. They can really help to direct people in the right direction. But what ends up happening with tests is I kind of have talked about, this motivation-based thing. A lot of tests actually are testing behavior. So they're looking at the way that you behave in the world and how that aligns with, these different types. And to really understand your Enneagram type, you have to understand your own core motivation and the core motivations of different Enneagram types. So with that, I think tests can be a guide to look at which numbers are most aligned with who you are and what type you are. But I really think that self-discovery is the best way to go. So whatever test you end up taking, it's really important to actually look at the individual types and read the descriptions, read about them, reflect on yourself. That's really the way to find your type. And if you insist on taking a test, there are some good ones out there. And the IEQ 9 actually I think is really good, but that one costs about $60. So the Truity test, the Ready, which is the Rizzo-Hudson Enneagram type indicator, is also good. But I think it's actually best, if you're going to take a test, to have an Enneagram coach or someone who's more of an expert to kind of decode the information that you're getting from it.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. So, what are the exact benefits of knowing your Enneagram type? Like, how does it benefit your life? How can you use that information from each of the types to better the different domains of your life? Like, whether it's, your work relationships, or maybe your relationship with your partner, or maybe the one with yourself, or things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So the Enneagram is just, like I mentioned, it's a growth tool. So really what you're wanting from it is not just to learn how to describe yourself, which is unfortunately what the Enneagram has become on Instagram in a lot of ways. It's become kind of like another basis for memes, which those are fun. But what it's really, good for is to grow. And so the Enneagram helps us to become more self-aware by bringing to the surface some things that we might not have realized about ourselves, but that we know are true deep down. You know what I mean? So like, maybe for a type 2, for example, maybe they always feel this sense of wanting love from other people and like needing more of that from other people, but they don't understand why, or they don't understand that that's their tendency. And then once they start realizing that, then they can actually break that pattern. So they can actually observe that pattern and then say, okay, this is what's underlying that for me. So like, let me pause, slow down that reaction and choose something different. And that's actually where it comes into play for those workplace relationships and other relationships as well, because one, it helps you to slow those automatic reactions and choose a healthier pattern. And it gives you more empathy for what other people are feeling and how they're thinking about things and what they're going through.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I like that. Now, there's the 9 types, which I know that there's a lot of information around them. So I'd love to dive in just a little bit, maybe high level on each one, into the different traits, the strengths or weaknesses that someone can experience being that type.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll also mention too here that when I talk about core motivation, one of the reasons that that's really helpful is because often in life, when we see a behavior that somebody else does, say, we're talking with someone and they just get silent, we typically ascribe our own motivations to that behavior. So, well, if I were to get silent, I would be angry, so they must be angry. But using the Enneagram, you can actually realize that like other people have different core motivations. And so it's probably a different motivation that's underneath something. So it kind of smooths our interactions too with that, where it's like we're not assuming things about other people based on their behavior.
Gotcha.
So I think that's also how it plays into relationships. So then all the 9 types, again, important to look at motivation. This is obviously going to be a really quick overview. So it's not going to be super in depth, but I think it can be a helpful starting point for folks who are listening and aren't familiar. So Enneagram 1s are idealists. They are motivated by the need to be good, right, and perfect. And this is actually more about integrity, morality, and ethics than it is about being the best. But they really want the world to be a better place. And their strength is that they bring excellence in everything that they do. So that's really the amazing thing that ones offer us. Their weakness is often that they're really self-critical. And so sometimes that hinders them from being impactful in the world in the way that they'd like to be. 2s are motivated by the need to be needed and to be loved and lovable for who they are and for being helpful to others. So they really care about how others feel in their interactions. Their strength is that they're so connective and relational, but their weakness is that they tend to believe that they don't actually need help themselves, and they tend to go it alone and ignore their own needs. Type 3s are motivated by the need to find their worth and their productivity. So they're not just concerned with success, though that often does matter to them. They're actually concerned with image and appearance and the appearance of looking successful because they're finding their worth in how others view them and their productivity. So their strength is that they're really adaptable and driven, but their weakness is often that they kind of don't know what they want deep down, and they don't really respect their own need for rest. 4s are motivated by the need to find their true heart, and they're on a lifelong quest for understanding their identity. And I know that sounds a little bit woo-woo, but I think that really resonates with 4s. So that's why I say it that way. And their strength is really that they're really out of the box thinkers. They really kind of can really think creatively. And I know a lot of times people say fours are the artsy types. And yes, that might be true, but just in general, they don't feel stuck in a box. They're very more imaginative. So their weakness, though, is that they have all these big dreams, and sometimes the actual actions that they need to take to make their dreams happen, it's just not, right there for them. Like the actions feel a lot harder. So they often don't follow their dreams because taking action feels more challenging. Fives are motivated by the need to be competent and self-reliant, and they actually increase their self-reliance by decreasing their needs and desires. So really all a five is looking for in life often is some way to fuel their thirst for knowledge and to kind of get that input. And they'll decrease everything else that they need in order to do that. And their strength is really that they are competent, that they are typically the most knowledgeable in the room. But their weakness is that they often have a really hard time getting out of their head and actually living in the real world. Sixes are motivated by the need to find safety and security in the world, and they're really deeply committed to that, and they're very loyal. And their strength is really that they can troubleshoot. They can see what things might go wrong, and they make a plan, a really solid plan for how to navigate that, so that not only they feel safe and stable with having things planned out, but also that others around them feel that stability as well. But their weakness is that they tend to kind of go overboard in planning sometimes, and they end up kind of spiraling with fears and kind of anxieties sometimes. So sevens are motivated by the need to be free of pain and to avoid discomfort. And they really just want to be free. They want to feel satisfied and content. So they're always chasing that satisfaction. So like how I mentioned with fives, they want self-reliance, and so they decrease their needs. Sevens are looking for that sense of satisfaction and contentment. And they do that by seeking out more opportunity and more things that will kind of make them feel filled up. Their strength is that they're really fun and enthusiastic often, and their weakness is that they have a really hard time being present. So that's really challenging for them. Eights are motivated by the need to protect themselves and to avoid vulnerability, and they really kind of go through life on gut intuition, and that actually works pretty well for them. They kind of have a gut feeling about people, and they tend to be right a lot of the time about that. And so their strength is actually strength. They are very strong and tough in a lot of ways. And that goes with not only like an outward show of strength, but often like a lot of mental strength and the ability to persevere through difficult things. But their weakness is that sometimes they believe that strength is all they need, and they forget to allow others that they care about to see kind of the tender or more the softer side of them. And then nines, finally. Nines are motivated by the need to find internal and external peace. And actually what's really challenging about that for nines is that they seek that peace to the extent that they actually forget about themselves and their own needs. And they're really looking to feel peaceful and to feel unbothered. But their strength is that they really bring unity because they're able to see the ways that all of us are actually similar. Their weakness is that they have a really hard time asserting themselves and speaking up for themselves. And they tend to kind of take more of a back seat in that sense. So those are all 9 core motivations and strengths and weaknesses. Obviously, I realize that was a really quick overview. There's a lot more to read and learn to find your type, but hopefully people can get a good idea of what each of the types are from that.
You do have a freebie that you offer on your website that kind of goes into the different types a little bit more in detail as well that people can sign up to receive, right?
Yep, exactly. So you can just get that on my website by clicking, I think it says like find my type.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
Perfect. Now, I did take the test multiple times because I wanted to make sure I was getting the right answer. And all 3 times that I took it, I did end up with type 1, my core type. which there's a lot of words that I'm going to dive into with you afterwards that I came across when I was looking through Enneagram that I kind of want to get a better understanding of. But I believe type 1 would be my core type. And then I got type 3, which was closely followed. So is that called like my subtype?
Oh, okay. Good question. So first off, which test did you take?
Oh, I don't remember now. It was an online test.
Okay, that's fine. Just out of curiosity. So what do you think about type 1? Does that feel like it resonates with you?
It does to some degree. I definitely thought when I was reading through all the different types that I would be more of type 3. But I can definitely see that I definitely have both in me.
Sure. So, yeah, one thing I'll note, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with the self-discovery, is super important to trust yourself. So, yes, maybe this test offered that you probably are a type 1 or a type 3. Those are the two that it guided you toward. And then do some self-reflection and reflect with yourself. Like when you are really good at something, what is underneath that? Like, do you want other people to see you as productive and as successful? Or is it that you really, it's not as much about what other people think, but you're really focused on being good, like having integrity and being moral and those types of things? So those are some good, observations to dive into. So that's the first thing. And then with tests, this is part of the thing that's confusing, right? Because we've got this language around wings and subtypes and all this different stuff. And so when a test offers you a couple different answers, it's easy to be like, oh, this is my wing and this is my subtype. So first off, you only have one core type. So even when a test gives you multiple answers, there's only one of those that is your core type. That's the first thing I would note. The second thing is, so you have to basically decide, trust yourself, journal, reflect, read, and find what the core motivation is between those two. And then when you're looking at a subtype, that's actually something else. So within each of the core types, there are 3 subtypes. So your core type would be, so say your core type is 1, then you could be a social subtype, a self-preservation subtype, or a sexual subtype. And that's a whole different thing. It's like a totally different theory. So that's what I think is so interesting about the Enneagram and so confusing, right?
Yeah,
Because it's like all these different words, all these different things, and it's so hard to explain, even in just like an hour podcast, or even like I do a lot of teachings with teams, trainings with teams, and typically those are an hour long. That's how long people want to commit to that. And I get all these questions. I'm like, oh, but it's so much information. So yeah, so the subtype is actually something a little bit different, but I'm really curious. As I was reading the core motivations earlier, did you feel like you really resonated more with the type 1 or the type 3?
I do have a tendency to always want to do the right thing and to always maintain a level of integrity that's super critical to me. When I think about it, like that to me is more important than how people would perceive me, whether it's like being highly organized or productive and whatnot. I do think that deep down in my core is something that's a stronger value to me. But then I do definitely want to be productive. Like I'm so highly organized, and that's kind of like what drives me is to be productive, to be efficient, to kind of always stay on top of my goals and to be always achieving the next thing and to kind of always just be moving forward. But that core integrity piece is really deep rooted.
Yeah. And I think that totally makes sense. And, a lot of the things that you described about, both of those can actually often be true of 1s and 3s. I think that's actually really hard. Like that, it's 1 and 3 is actually a hard one to parse, and obviously only you can really do that for yourself. But it's really hard because both 1s and 3s really want that efficiency and want that productivity and everything. And that's actually something that with all the types I find that people struggle with is they're like, if somebody is having a hard time finding their type, they're like, but I really love to have fun. And so they're like, so I must be a 7. And I'm like, well, let's look a little deeper, and that's fascinating that it's really all about like asking yourself why, why is this a value for me? And it sounds like for you, from what you're saying, you resonate more with the type 1.
Yeah. Yeah, I can definitely see that.
But I will say that I think the best way to really narrow down your type is to look at the really negative sides of that core type.
Okay. And what are the negative sides of reformer and achiever again?
Okay, so negative side of the reformer. So that's type 1. Oh, I should have mentioned that earlier. So there are all these different names, like monikers for each of the types. So type 1 can be called the reformer, the improver, the fixer, the perfectionist. And then type 3 can be called the achiever, the performer. Those are the two main ones. And the reason I don't use those is because I think sometimes people are like, well, I resonate with this core motivation, but I don't really resonate with this name for it. Or like a lot of people are like, I am a perfectionist, but I'm not a 1, you know?
Yeah, if it was called perfectionist, I would have immediately just gone straight to that without even really diving deep when I should have, probably, right?
Yeah. Or like, for example, for 3s, like a lot of people are like, well, I'm an achiever, so I must be a 3. And it's like, well, not necessarily. So, and I will say too, I have a little bit of like, I have a different perspective on a lot of these things than other people do. So that's why it's sometimes a little bit, I think people ask me these questions and I'm like, that's not how I teach it. But that doesn't mean it's wrong. Like, that doesn't mean any of those things are wrong. It's just not how I teach it, but it doesn't mean it's wrong. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So, unhealthy side of a type 1 reformer perfectionist is that they often tend to, so 1s really want to be appropriate. They want to do the right thing at all times. And often they don't believe that showing their true feelings and emotions is appropriate. But 1s actually have a lot of anger underneath the surface. And so they really suppress that so that they can stay appropriate. So one of the ways that that anger comes out is frustration and resentment to those around them who they perceive as not doing enough. So that's one of the big things for 1s. Another huge thing is that 1s have what's called an inner critic who is constantly berating them, telling them they're not doing enough, that they're terrible, that they're not perfect, etc. So a lot of 1s have to really battle that. And especially when they're unhealthy, that leaks out to judgment and frustration and anger at everyone around them too. So they can be really, really critical when they're not healthy. Really, really judgmental of how people are doing literally anything. And 1s, especially when unhealthy, but in general, 1s tend to be really black and white, really rigid. They believe that there is one right way to do it. And often 1s believe that they know the right way to do it and everyone else is wrong.
Oh my God, you just nailed me on the head.
Right. So isn't that interesting how it's like you hear that shadow side and you're like, oh, that's me, you know?
It's like cringing inside. I'm like, oh God.
Yeah. It's okay. It's okay. Everyone feels that way about their type. So then the negative type about type 3 is that 3s are so really like hell-bent on seeming productive and seeming successful to others that they ignore any of their own desires and own needs and wants, and they really like are only focused on how other people perceive them. So they have a really hard time trusting themselves and their true emotions because they don't know what they are. They tamp all their emotions down and just like put their head down, drive forward. They're very motivated in that way, but they end up often doing things or end up being someone who's not really aligned with their values because they don't know what their values are. Like they don't slow down and really consider things. And they're so adaptable that they can end up kind of becoming different people in different spheres. And then the other big thing that 3s do when they're really unhealthy is that they just need attention. That they want the attention from other people. So they'll do whatever they need to get it, a lot of the time 3s get attention by being excellent and being like awesome and being the best and winning, etc. But sometimes 3s get attention by, maybe gossiping or not telling the full truth, things like that. So that's really the low side or the shadow side of type 3s.
Okay, I'm definitely a reformer. Or type 1, sorry. Type 1.
Yeah.
That definitely doesn't relate to me as much as type 1.
So isn't that so interesting though? Where it's like you can hear all of these things and they both really resonate, but then once you look at like the negative aspects of yourself, you're like, oh, okay.
Yeah, definitely. So how do you use that information to grow as a person?
Yeah. First, you have to find, that motivation and kind of, especially when you see something in yourself you don't like, observe why you did that. So, for example, in that I mentioned that threes might, gossip, for example, because they want attention, but they might not realize that in the moment. They might just be like, oh, I just, I wanted other people to be able to support this person or something. And they might kind of convince themselves they're doing it for a charitable reason. And then later they reflect on it, or they think about it and realize like, oh, why I did that. Why did I share that piece of information that wasn't mine to share? Oh, maybe that's because I wanted attention. And so starting to notice that, right? That's the very first step, just observing it. And then kind of asking the self why, and then choosing something different. Like, so saying like, okay, why do I need attention from people all the time? Like, what is it about myself that I believe isn't worthy of just being okay without getting attention from others? And so digging a little deeper. And obviously a lot of this can be done in things like therapy or in coaching too, but sometimes even just with yourself, it can be really, really valuable. So digging deeper, thinking about that, journaling about it, reflecting on it, and then really addressing that core need within yourself first. So what is the thing that you need? Maybe you do need to give yourself a little bit more care, more self-acceptance, more self-kindness. Maybe those are the things that are really, maybe you're judging others because you're really harshly judging yourself, things like that. So noticing those core things underneath and then reflecting on them. And then the next time that comes up, once you've dealt with it within yourself, then the next time you can be like, okay, I'm going to choose something different, And because you've learned to observe that, to ask yourself why, to understand what's behind it, to address those things that you actually need, and then to slow down that reaction so it's not so automatic anymore that you're like, this happened and then I fly off the handle. It's like, oh, okay, I'm going to pause. And I know it's not that straightforward. It's like kind of depends on the person. It kind of takes a lot of hard work, but that's actually the only way to grow.
That's so interesting. So, like, the more that we're diving into this, I'm gaining a better understanding of what this is. And it truly is like your first step into a self-discovery journey.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the same as, human design and things like that. Like, it's truly a tool to use in diving in deeper and truly understanding how you're working and, overcoming all of these negative traits that you might have and, not letting them take you off the path that you want to go.
Yeah. And I'll tell you, like, so I'm a 3. Mm-hmm. So we've got a 1 and a 3 here, right? And both of us tend to really, both of our types, I'll say, I won't speak for you necessarily, but both of our types tend to feel like we're not doing enough. Mm-hmm. And both of our types tend to be really into self-improvement. Mm-hmm. Because we want to be the best version of ourselves. And one of the most challenging things about the Enneagram is like, you just can't force it. Like, you can't force that growth, Yeah. You can't just act better and become better. It really is, like you're saying, that inner work, that growth.
Amazing. So you talked about core types and subtypes, which now I understand was not at all what I thought it was. Mm-hmm. And then we talked a little bit about wing types, and that is when you have, like, when I said that I had my core as the type 1, and then I had type 3 that was closely followed, that would be considered a wing type, correct?
Not exactly. No. I know.
All right, so teach me about this.
Yeah, well, and so I will also say, this is why I don't love tests, right? I said that before. But like, it can, like, the results that they give you can be really confusing. So your wing type is actually, and some people really love to look at wings. Some people, like, I personally don't always think it's that important, but I'll just talk about what it is, so that, because some people do find it really useful. So your wing type is an adjacent type to your core type that modifies your behavior. So your core type is your why you do what you do, and your wing type is more about how. So how do you show up in the world? So, and like, how does your core motivation get lived out? So your core type, so for example, you're a 1, so your wing types that can then be type 2 or type 9.
Oh.
Some people don't feel like they resonate with a wing at all. Some people feel like they resonate strongly with 1, and we'll do like a little W in between. So they'll say like 1 wing 9, for example. And then other people resonate strongly with both wings. So that's the really interesting thing that I think that can pop up about wings, is that as you go around the circle, and I don't know if you noticed this earlier when I was talking about the different types, it kind of feels like the ones that are adjacent to each other are opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Like ones are so task oriented, but on one side they've got a type that is really, really people driven and connective and relational. And then on the other side, they've got a type that's really like about everything is gray area, really about peace and about finding comfort and ease and that kind of thing. And what I was just saying are like the 2 and the 9.
Mm-hmm.
So the really interesting thing about the wing is that it can bring balance to your core type. So it kind of calms some of that energy that you have for a type 1, whereas for maybe a type 9, the 2 wing types bring energy to the type that is so easygoing.
Gotcha.
So to find your wing type, basically what you do is you look at those types and see which you resonate with more. It's not really a scientific kind of way to do it.
I definitely think I would resonate with type 9 a lot more, just because there is that the negative side of type 1 has that frustration and that anger that sometimes I repress. So
Yeah.
I'm constantly looking for calm and peace and whatnot in my life.
Yeah. That makes sense.
That's so interesting. Okay, that makes so much more sense. Now, another word that kind of stumbled me a little bit when I was reading through all this is centers. And I have absolutely no idea how they relate to a type and what they're for.
Yeah. So the centers of intelligence are essentially the head, heart, and body centers. So, and what these mean is actually we each have a specific center of intelligence. And it's not like you just go and say like, oh, this is my center of intelligence. Each of the types is in one of these centers. So 8, 9, and 1 are all in what's called the body center. And each of the centers also has like a core emotion, a core feeling underneath. So the body centers all have anger as their core emotion. So that's kind of the body. And then the heart intelligence center is about like sadness or shame underneath. And that's 2, 3, and 4. And then the head intelligence center is about fear or anxiety underneath. And that's 5, 6, and 7. So the reason that matters, often people, when they can't find their type, like for example, if we were in a typing session and you couldn't decide if you were type 1 or type 3, what I would go into more is talking about that aspect of it. So how do you perceive information? Like, how do you take in information? Is it through gut instinct? Or is it through emotional intelligence? And then also talking about kind of what is the underlying emotion that maybe you're running from or you're suppressing or whatever. So that's how the centers work. And there's actually a lot of really good work that can be done around that, because they each have, something that they're longing for. So the body centers really want boundaries in different ways and comfort and justice. The heart centers really want, they're looking for identity and image, whether that's self-image or the image of others. And then the head centers are really about finding some security and safety. Even though that's like the main thing for 6s, it also comes up in 5s and 7s. So there's a lot of really interesting work that can be done around those too.
That's crazy. So I'm definitely a body center for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you've got that gut instinct, but sometimes 1s and 9s have a little bit of a harder time tapping into their gut instinct because they repress so much anger that they might not always listen to their gut.
Interesting. Okay. So I want to dive into what it's like working with you. Like if somebody is wanting to either work with you individually to figure out what their Enneagram type is, what does that whole experience look like? What can they expect?
Yeah. So basically, I do typing sessions. That's actually probably my most popular service. Just basically like a 40 to 45 minute conversation in which I just ask questions and we kind of have a conversation about different aspects of somebody's life. And, I'll just ask questions about motivations and ask a lot of why. And then it's kind of interesting because what I do is called Enneagram coaching. But if you've ever done life coaching is very, it's very open-ended. It's not very directive. Enneagram coaching is a little bit more directive, and it's focused on pairing that coaching thing with also education. So often in a typing session, somebody will say, well, this doesn't really feel like something a 7 would do. And then I'll say, okay, well, like, let's unpack that a little bit and kind of talk about the motivation that's underneath somebody's behavior that might actually point more toward a specific type. So it's a little bit open-ended, and then it's also some education and bringing clarity. And then I always kind of offer some growth tips too.
Awesome. Okay. I love that. Okay. So you have a new book also coming out.
It comes out, well, by the time this airs, it'll be out. It's out on June 9th.
Awesome. Okay. So it's The Enneagram in Love, which I love love. So the moment I saw that, I was like, oh, I just want to learn so much more about this. So what is the book about? What can we expect from reading it? How is it going to benefit our relationships?
Yeah. So it's really, the subtitle is basically that it's a roadmap for building and strengthening romantic relationships. It can actually be good for all relationships, but it's really geared towards romantic relationships. They're kind of like my free self-typing guide you mentioned earlier. There is some of that in the book as well, like on how to find your type. But it talks about each of the types, how they show up in love and how they show up in relationships, which is interesting, mostly because I talked about the unhealthy and the healthy, and then also the kind of the average levels of behavior that each of the types kind of exhibits. And then the part that I think people are most excited about is the type pairings. So there are 45 different type pairings. And what I mean is that it's like 1 and 1, 1 and 2, so on and so forth. 45 different unique combinations. And each of those is described in the book with some areas to work on, as well as some strengths for each of the pairings. So that's really helpful, just because, one, it allows you to understand your partner a little bit better and to show up with more empathy with your partner or your friend or your roommate or whoever you're reading it with. So that's kind of the main thing. And it just allows you to have more empathy and more connection, and kind of gives you some ways to find that and to actually grow your relationship.
I love that, because there's so much to learn about each other in a relationship, and you never truly understand kind of where they're coming from all the time. You always just kind of expect them to be the same as you, or they're reacting the same way that you would. But I always find it so interesting when there's resources out there that help you understand your partner a lot more, so that you guys are able to connect on a deeper level, like the 5 love languages, things like that. That was kind of like mind blowing to me. So I can't wait to read this book and to use it in a relationship and see how it helps.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely think, feedback so far has been that it's been really helpful, which just makes me happy, because that's the goal. That's why I do all of my work, is to help people feel more connected to themselves and more connected to others.
Definitely. I love it. Okay, so last question. If anybody wants to learn more about you or the Enneagram, where can they connect with you? Because they definitely should.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram at 9typesco, and then my website, which is 9types.co, and all of it is all spelled out. So spell out the word 9. And then also I have a brand new podcast as well called Ask an Enneagram Coach, in which I answer questions kind of like the ones that we talked about today, where I go through and give in-depth answers to common questions that I receive from Instagram and elsewhere. So those are the main ways you can find me. And I'm always happy to connect. You can send me a DM and tell me that you found me on the Love Unplugged podcast.
Amazing. I'm definitely going to have to check out that podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, I just started it, so.
Congratulations. Podcasts are amazing. I think you're going to love it.
Yes.
Are you just doing solo shows? Are you having guests on your show? Or?
Solo shows for now. I might have guests in the future, but I wanted something that was like literally talking about the Enneagram theory.
Mm-hmm.
I find that there are a lot of shows doing interviews, but not a lot of shows actually sharing about the theory. And then also, I just wanted it to be easy for me. Mm-hmm. Honestly, like I want to be able to, go in my little recording space and just knock it out, instead of having to coordinate and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steph, for taking the time to share so much insight about the Enneagram, which I have such a deeper level of understanding now as to what I am and how I can use it in my life to deepen that self-discovery journey that I'm on. And I know so many are going to benefit from this as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm Jessica, and thanks for tuning in today to Love Unplugged, the podcast. If there are any questions or topics you'd love answered on the show, head on over to www.projectloveco.com and share your request with me. If you haven't yet, go to iTunes and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast and share it with a loved one. Your feedback means the world to me, and the community we've created is what fuels our discussions here. After all, this is all for you. Join me next time for another unplugged conversation.